Welcome to Module 2, the Human Conscience Clause. Before we talk about policies, before we talk about frameworks, I want to talk to you about something you already carry with you, your conscience. Because compliance doesn't begin with legislation, it begins with a decision. And that decision happens long before anything gets documented. Module 1 was about governance. This module is about the moment before governance. The split second when you choose pause or click. Speak up or stay quiet. Document it or assume someone else will. That moment, that's the human conscience clause. Now, House Bill 96 never uses that phrase, but it's often its entire framework, and it assumes it exists because no law can force integrity. It can require documentation, it can require oversight, but it cannot manufacture character. That's human. So our objectives for this training module is define what conscience means in the context of compliance, not as morality in theory, but as decision-making under pressure. We'll connect House Bill 96's intent to personal accountability. Because if governance is documented behavior, conscience is what drives that behavior. And we'll relate this to NIST 2.0, govern and protect functions. But here's the key. Governance isn't just structure. Protection isn't just software. They're reflections of human judgment. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had that moment where something just didn't feel right? An email, a shortcut, a request that seemed slightly off, and you felt it? That hesitation, that internal nudge? That's not paranoia, that's conscience. And in cybersecurity, that instinct can be the difference between an incident and prevention. So in Module 1, we said the strongest firewall in your organization isn't hardware, it's people. This module goes deeper because the strongest firewall inside a person is your conscience. So think about a time in your career where you chose to do the hard, right thing instead of the easy, wrong one. Nobody may have noticed, but you did. And that's the muscle that we're strengthening in this module. If Module 1 was about rebuilding trust externally, Module 2 is about reinforcing integrity internally. Because trust doesn't begin in documentation, it begins in decision. And today we're going to examine that decision. Now, before we go deeper into this module, let's ground ourselves in what we're trying to actually accomplish today. Because this session is a little different from the first one. Module 1 focused on systems and governance. Module 2 focuses on the human decision behind those systems. So we're going to define the human conscience in compliance specifically. First, we're going to define what we mean by the human conscience in the context of compliance. Now that may sound philosophical at first, but it's actually very practical. In cybersecurity and governance, conscience shows up as a moment of hesitation. That small pause where someone asks, does this look right? Should I double check this? Is this something I should report? That instinct is often the first control in the entire security architecture. Before a firewall blocks traffic, before monitoring tools raise an alert, before an audit discovers a gap, a human being notices something and pauses. That's conscience in action. So regarding House Bill 96 and personal accountability, we're going to connect House Bill 96's intent to personal accountability as House Bill 96 sets expectations for governance, documentation, and oversight. But these things don't happen automatically. They happen because someone decides to document the decision, log the incident, escalate the concern, follow the process even when it would be easier not to. That's the human layer of compliance. Policies define the rules. People give the results life. So regarding NIST 2.0, govern and protect functions, you're going to hear those terms a lot throughout this training. Governance is about accountability. Who owns the decision? Who defines the policy? Who ensures oversight? Protection is about safeguards, access controls, training, security behavior that prevents incidents before they start. But here's the important connection. Governance and protection don't begin with technology. They begin with human awareness. Someone recognizing the risk, someone choosing responsibly. So today we're going to explore something simple but powerful. Before compliance becomes documentation, it begins as a decision, and that decision lives in people. So let's take the idea of conscience one step further. Most people think of ethics as something philosophical, something you talk about in classrooms or leadership seminars. But in cybersecurity and compliance, ethics functions much more like infrastructure. In other words, it's built into how the organization actually operates. Think about security architecture for a moment, because I know everybody loves to, right? You don't rely on one single control to protect a system. You layer safeguards, firewalls, access controls, monitoring, incident response. Ethical awareness works the same way. It becomes a human layer of security architecture. Every person who pauses before acting becomes part of that protection system. And you have a role. If you use technology inside your organization, that pause you take before you act, before you click, before you put your credentials in, will become part of your protection system. That's why you're going through this training, because you need to recognize the signs and pause and act accordingly so that you don't take your organization down. So if you're wondering why all this matters, that's it right there. Ethical awareness as security architecture is an idea that we're exploring here. It's ethical awareness, and it acts like a safeguard. When people understand why rules exist, not just what the rules are, they make better decisions under pressure. You recognize the risks earlier. You ask better questions. You slow down when something feels off. That's not just good character. That's operational security. So we talk about this concept of pause, verify, protect as a reflex. This is a simple reflex we want to reinforce across the organization. Pause, verify, protect. 3 small steps, but they interrupt the exact moment where most incidents begin. Before clicking a suspicious link, before approving unexpected access, before forwarding sensitive information, pause, verify the system, verify the source, and you protect the system. If enough people build that reflex, the organization will be significantly harder to compromise. And that's what we want. Because attackers rely on speed and distraction, this reflex removes both. So here's a reflection that I want you to take. Let me ask you it this way. How many incidents do you think you're preventing every single day? Because someone paused for 5 seconds. Not because of a tool, not because of a policy, but because a person noticed something and slowed down. That's the reflex that we're strengthening here. So if Module 1 was about governance systems, and the opening of this module was about conscience, this section shows how conscience becomes behavior, and behavior becomes security architecture. Next, we're going to explore what happens when that behavior is tested under pressure, because that's where compliance becomes courage. So far, we've talked about conscience. We've talked about the pause, that moment where someone senses something may not be right. But here's the real challenge. Compliance decisions rarely happen when everything is calm and clear. They happen when people are busy, when deadlines are tight, when a supervisor needs something quickly, when an email arrives that looks urgent. In other words, under pressure. So ethical decision making under pressure, what does that mean? The first thing we're going to explore is how ethical decision making works when pressure enters the picture, because pressure is exactly what attackers count on. They want you moving fast. They want you reacting emotionally. They want urgency to override judgment. That's why so many phishing messages say things like, immediate action required. Your account will be locked. Please review this invoice right away. Pressure will short-circuit careful thinking, and ethical awareness is what restores it. And it gives people permission to slow down and ask, is this legitimate? Does this follow our processes? Should someone else review this? That's where conscience turns into action. So that ties back to House Bill 96. But let me ask you something. Think about a time where you were asked to do something quickly at work. Maybe it was late in the day. Maybe you were juggling several tasks and something about the request didn't sit quite right. What made you stop? Was it experience, training, instinct? That pause, that moment of judgment is exactly what we're trying to strengthen. Because the truth is, technology can catch many threats, and it is. But people are catching the rest. And when people trust their judgment under pressure, organizations become far more resilient. Next, we're going to look at what happens when that moment of pressure turns into real-world decision, because that's where integrity becomes visible. So far in this module, we've talked about the individual, the moment of hesitation, the pause, the decision to verify something before acting. But individuals don't operate in a vacuum. They operate inside of organizational culture, and culture has a powerful influence on compliance. Workplace culture and compliance quality. What does that mean? Let's start with the first idea. Workplace culture directly affects compliance quality. If an organization values transparency, people feel safe asking questions. They feel comfortable reporting concerns. They slow down when something doesn't seem right. But if the culture rewards speed over accuracy or discourages raising concerns, people are more likely to bypass safeguards just to keep things moving. Not because they intended harm, but because the environment subtly pushes them that way. Culture shapes behavior long before policies ever come into play. So ethical confidence and audit readiness. We've got to connect this idea to audit readiness. Many organizations think audit readiness is about documentation, and documentation absolutely matters. But there's another factor that often gets overlooked, ethical confidence. What does that mean? Well, that's the confidence employees have to say, this doesn't look right. Let's double check this. Let's document the decision before moving forward. And when people feel empowered to do that, two things are going to happen. Problems are going to get caught earlier, and documentation becomes stronger and more accurate. Which means when an audit happens, the organization isn't scrambling to reconstruct what happened. The evidence is already there. So a reflection question. Let me ask you something. In your organization, when someone notices a potential problem, do they feel encouraged to raise it, or do they hesitate because they don't want to cause trouble? That difference, that moment of hesitation, tells you a lot about a culture. And culture ultimately determines how well compliance actually works. Because in the end, the strongest policies in the world can't protect an organization if the culture discourages people from using them. So next we're going to look at what happens when ethical awareness becomes a shared habit across an organization. Because when that happens, compliance stops feeling like enforcement and starts feeling like stewardship. So as we close out this section of the module, I want to zoom out for a moment. Everything we've talked about so far, conscience, ethical decision making, workplace culture, ultimately connects to something larger, public service. Because compliance in government organizations isn't just an internal requirement, it's part of a civic responsibility. So compliance is a shared civic duty. What does that mean? The first idea here is framing compliance as a shared civic duty. Every person in an agency touches systems, data, or processes that are going to affect the public. And the public trusts that those systems will operate responsible. That means compliance isn't just an IT responsibility. It isn't just a leadership responsibility. It's shared. HR protects personnel information. Finance protects financial records. Operation protects service delivery systems. IT protects infrastructure. Every role contributes to the same outcome, public trust. So under House Bill 96, what does human accountability look like? This is where it becomes very human, by the way. It requires governance structures and documentation. But those structures only work when people actively participate in them. Someone logs the incident. Someone updates the policy. Someone reviews the access list. Someone escalates a concern. Every one of those actions is a human decision. House Bill 96 doesn't remove human responsibility, it reinforces it. So how do we connect all this evidence to the compliance evidence playbook? And it always brings us back to that. You're going to hear that term so much through this training, you'll know what I mean. And when you seek test questions, if the compliance evidence playbook is an option, that's probably the right one. Just a little teaser there for you. Because the compliance evidence playbook is where all of these human decisions become visible. Every documented action becomes part of a record that shows how risks were handled, how decisions were made, how the organizations responded when something unexpected happened. The CEP is more than documentation. It's the institutional memory of responsible governance. So let me ask you something. If someone looked at your agency's compliance evidence playbook 5 years from now, what story would it tell? Would it show an organization that reacted to problems or an organization that anticipated them and acted responsibly? That's the difference between compliance as an obligation and compliance as stewardship. Because when compliance becomes part of shared civic duty, it stops feeling like oversight and starts feeling like service. And that's exactly the mindset House Bill 96 is trying to reinforce. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final idea. Every policy we talked about today, every safeguard, every control, every line of documentation ultimately reflects human conscience in action. Because behind every policy is a person making a decision to slow down, a decision to ask a question, a decision to document something honestly, a decision to speak up when something doesn't look right. And the Compliance Evidence Playbook, the CEP, is where those decisions become visible. It's more than a record, it's a symbol of ethical maturity. It shows that an organization doesn't just follow the law. It understands why the law exists in the first place, to protect people, to protect trust, and to prove that public institutions are worthy of that trust. So here's my challenge for you after this session. Take one small step this week, just one. Maybe you document one process a little more cleanly than you did before. Question one assumption instead of rushing past it. Or thank a colleague for doing the right thing when it would have been easier not to. Because culture doesn't change through major speeches. It changes through small decisions repeated consistently. And those moments, the quiet ones, are what shapes an organization's character. It's the kind of culture House Bill 96 is trying to build. And I'll leave you with this thought. In a world of systems and safeguards, conscience is still the best firewall. And with that, thank you for your attention today, and more importantly, thank you for the choices you make when nobody's watching. Because compliance isn't just about policies, it's about everyday decisions. Every time you document something cleanly, every time you ask one more question, every time you raise a concern early instead of ignoring it, you're not just checking a box, you're protecting trust. And that's what this entire series is about. So here's where we go next. In Module 3, the audit chain and you, we're going to connect the decisions we talked about today to something very concrete, the audit trail. Because sooner or later, every organization faces the same question. How do you know? Prove it. How do you know the policy was followed? How do you know the safeguard was applied? How do you know the decision was documented? Module 3 is where we're going to answer that question, and we'll show you how the small actions you take every day, every one of you, become part of the chain of evidence that proves your agency is doing the right thing. So thank you for the work you do. We'll see you in Module 3.